The annual Miller family dinner was in full swing in my parents' tastefully renovated Victorian home. Crystal glasses clinked, silver scraped against fine china, and the steady hum of polite conversation filled the dining room. I sat at my usual spot, third chair on the left, not quite at the children's end of the table anymore, but decidedly not at the center of attention either. That spotlight, as always, shone directly on my sister Diana. And then Diana's professor actually asked if she'd consider submitting her paper to the Journal of Biological Chemistry, my mother was saying, her voice carrying that unmistakable note of maternal pride. Apparently, it's quite unusual for undergraduates to be published there. I speared a roasted carrot with slightly more force than necessary, watching as Diana maintained the perfect balance of modesty and confidence. "It's really not that big a deal, Mom," she demurred, though her small smile betrayed her pleasure. "Dr. Winters just thought my approach was somewhat novel. Novel enough for a prestigious journal," my father chimed in, raising his wine glass in a spontaneous toast to Diana Stanford Medical School's future valedictorian. Glasses rose around the table, and I dutifully lifted mine, taking a larger sip than strictly appropriate for the expensive Cabernet. At 24, I was 2 years older than my sister, but seemingly light years behind in achievements worth mentioning at family gatherings. It wasn't that I was doing poorly. My job as a graphic designer at a small but respected marketing agency was going well. I had my own apartment in the city. I paid my bills on time. But in the Miller family, meeting basic adult expectations wasn't cause for celebration. Exceptional was the baseline. Extraordinary was the goal. "James, honey, how's your work going?" my mother asked, suddenly remembering my existence. "Still doing those website layouts?" "Actually, I just finished leading a complete rebrand for Meridian Healthcare," I replied, seizing the opening. It was a major project. New logo, visual identity system, website, everything. The CEO personally called to Diana, interrupted my Aunt Patricia. "Tell everyone about that research fellowship you applied for. The one in Switzerland." And just like that, the spotlight swung back to its rightful owner. I returned to my roasted carrots, listening as Diana described the prestigious fellowship that would almost certainly be added to her collection of accomplishments. Across the table, my grandmother caught my eye. Unlike my parents, whose attention was wholly captured by Diana's narrative, Grandma Rose was watching me with her shrewd blue eyes. At 82, she remained the most perceptive person in the family, noticing what others missed. She gave me a small, sympathetic smile before turning to her friend Eleanor Vasquez, who was attending our family dinner for the first time. Eleanor was Grandma's oldest friend. They'd taught together at the same high school for over 40 years. Though retired for more than a decade, both maintained the alert posture and observant gaze of veteran educators. I'd met Eleanor briefly upon arriving, but hadn't spoken to her directly. "N. We just found out yesterday that Diana's been selected as one of only 3 students to work directly with Dr. Harriet Chun next semester," my father was saying now, his chest visibly puffing with pride. "Dr. Chun is a pioneer in genetic research," my mother explained to the table at large. "She won the Lasker Award last year, which is often a precursor to the Nobel Prize." I reached for my wine again, wishing I could text my roommate from college, Luke, who would appreciate the absurdity of the Diana show as we'd come to call these family performances years ago. But pulling out my phone at the dinner table would only give my mother another reason to draw unfavorable comparisons between her children. "James." The sharp, clear voice cut through the ambient conversation like a thunderclap. All heads turned toward Eleanor Vasquez, who was staring directly at me with surprising intensity. "Yes?" I responded, startled into straightening my posture. "You're Rose's grandson who created that extraordinary digital art exhibition at the Hayworth Gallery last month, aren't you?" Eleanor asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. A peculiar silence fell over the table. I felt blood rushing to my face as every eye turned toward me. Yes, that was me," I managed, acutely aware of my parents' confused expressions. Eleanor turned to address the table. "It was the most innovative use of digital media I've seen in years," she declared emphatically. The way he combined traditional artistic techniques with interactive technology was absolutely remarkable. My grandmother was smiling now, a knowing look in her eyes that suggested Eleanor's outburst wasn't entirely spontaneous. "James had an exhibition?" my mother asked, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. "At the Hayworth?" And just like that, the careful narrative of our family dinner tilted on its axis, all because a retired art teacher had shouted my name. The Hayworth Gallery wasn't MoMA or the Guggenheim, but in our city's art scene. It was respected, known for showcasing emerging talents alongside established artists. My exhibition, a series of interactive digital installations exploring memory and identity, had run for 3 weeks in the gallery's smaller East Wing. I hadn't mentioned it to my parents. It wasn't spite, exactly, or perhaps it was partly, but it was also self-preservation. Years of having my achievements casually acknowledged before conversation returned to Diana's latest triumph had taught me to guard the things that mattered most. My art was personal in a way my day job wasn't. I didn't want to hear my mother's polite "that's nice, dear," or my father's inevitable questions about whether it would lead to better paying opportunities. "I don't understand," my father said, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "You had an entire exhibition? Of what, exactly?" Before I could answer, Eleanor leaned forward, her silver bob swinging with the intensity of her movement. Digital art installations that responded to human interaction. Each piece evolved based on how viewers engaged with it. One installation actually incorporated the viewer's own reflections, fragmenting and reassembling them to comment on how memory distorts our self-perception. She turned to me. "I'm describing it poorly, James. You should explain your work." The attention of the entire table, 14 people, including my parents, sister, aunts, uncles, cousins, and grandmother, was now fixed on me with an intensity I'd never experienced at a family gathering. Diana looked as surprised as everyone else, which gave me a small, petty satisfaction. For once, she hadn't been briefed in advance on a family member's accomplishments. "It's a series called Reflections and Refractions," I explained, finding my voice. "Digital art that uses sensors and cameras to create unique experiences based on how viewers interact with each piece. The technology responds to movement, facial expressions, even the amount of time someone spends looking at different elements." "But how did you get into the Hayworth?" my mother asked, still looking slightly stunned. "Don't they usually feature more established artists?" The implication was clear. How had I, her less remarkable child, managed to secure exhibition space at a respected gallery? "Juried competition," I replied, meeting her gaze. "They had an open call for their new Perspectives series. Over 300 artists submitted portfolios. They chose 8. 8 out of 300? My father's expression shifted slightly, the first glimmer of genuine interest I'd seen from him regarding my creative work. "That's quite selective. James has always been talented artistically," Grandma Rose interjected smoothly. "Surely you remember how the elementary school displayed his work in the district art show every year." My mother looked momentarily flustered. "Well, yes, of course, he was always creative, but the exhibition runs through next weekend," Eleanor continued, overriding my mother's response. "The gallery added additional evening hours because of the unexpected attendance. The wait time was nearly 45 minutes when I visited last Saturday. This was news even to me. I knew attendance had been solid, but the gallery director hadn't mentioned extended hours during our last email exchange. People waited in line to see James's art? My cousin Ethan, 16, and usually engrossed in his phone during family gatherings, looked up with newfound respect. "Indeed they did," Eleanor confirmed. "Many returned for a second viewing, including myself. Each experience with the installations is unique. The digital elements respond differently depending on the viewer and their movements." My Aunt Patricia, who had so eagerly redirected conversation to Diana's fellowship application earlier, now turned to me with a curious expression. "How does that work, exactly? The technology?" As I began explaining the custom software I'd developed, I caught Diana watching me with an unreadable expression. We'd been close as young children, co-conspirators building blanket forts and creating elaborate imaginary worlds before achievements and parental expectations had gradually driven a wedge between us. Now our relationship was cordial but distant, shaped by the unspoken competition that our parents had fostered, intentionally or not. So each installation collects data from environmental sensors and viewer interactions, then uses algorithms I designed to create unique visual and auditory responses. I continued, aware that I was speaking with an animation I rarely displayed at family gatherings. "That sounds technically complex," my father noted, his tone suggesting he was reevaluating something fundamental about his understanding of my capabilities. "Where did you learn to code at that level?" "Self-taught, mostly," I replied. "I started in high school, remember? That summer I locked myself in my room working on that game design project? The summer we thought you were just playing video games," my mother said, with the slightly uncomfortable laugh of someone recognizing a past misjudgment. I was trying to build them, actually. The words came out more pointed than I'd intended. A brief, awkward silence followed, broken by my grandmother. James has always been quietly determined, she said, her voice carrying the gentle authority that had commanded classrooms for 4 decades. He doesn't announce his goals with fanfare. He simply works toward them with persistence. It's a quality I've always admired. Her words hung in the air, their implication clear to anyone paying attention. Diana's achievements were certainly impressive, but they were also loudly celebrated, expected, and continuously reinforced by parental approval. Mine had developed in the shadows, unwatered by recognition, yet somehow still growing. Eleanor nodded in agreement with my grandmother. The art world has taken notice too. Did you see the review in the Tribune, Rose? The critic called James's work a breakthrough in how digital art can create deeply personal, emotionally resonant experiences rather than merely technical showcases. There was a review in the Tribune? My mother's voice had risen half an octave. The Tribune was the city's most respected newspaper, and its art criticism was notoriously exacting. Front page of the arts section last Sunday, Eleanor confirmed. I brought a copy, actually. I thought Rose might want it for her scrapbook. She reached into her large handbag and extracted a carefully folded newspaper section, which she passed to my grandmother. As Grandma Rose unfolded the paper, revealing a full-color image of viewers interacting with my central installation, I caught a glimpse of my sister's expression. For a fraction of a second, something that looked remarkably like hurt flashed across her features before she composed herself. "This is remarkable, James," my father said, leaning over to examine the newspaper. "Why didn't you tell us about any of this?" The question hung in the air, seemingly innocent yet loaded with implications. Why hadn't I shared this significant achievement with my family? Why had they needed to learn about it from my grandmother's friend at a dinner party? The answer, of course, was sitting in the complex history of our family dynamics, in the thousands of moments when Diana's accomplishments had been centered while mine were peripheral. In the subtle messaging that her path was the one that mattered most in my eventual decision to stop seeking approval that never quite measured up to what my sister received automatically. Before I could formulate a diplomatic response, Diana herself spoke up. "The real question is why we didn't know about it," she said, looking directly at our parents. "James's exhibition has apparently been open for weeks, got a major review, and none of us bothered to find out." She turned to me, something apologetic in her gaze. "That's on us, not you." Her unexpected alliance shifted the atmosphere once again. For perhaps the first time in our adult lives, Diana had publicly acknowledged the imbalance in our family's attention economy. The gesture was small but significant, a hairline crack in the foundation of our family's established patterns. As conversation tentatively resumed around the table, now centered on my work rather than Diana's, I caught Eleanor exchanging a satisfied glance with my grandmother. Their intervention had been deliberate, a strategic disruption of the family dynamic they had clearly discussed beforehand. The question was, now that the pattern had been interrupted, what would happen next? The remainder of dinner unfolded in uncharted territory. My parents, thrown off their usual script, attempted to navigate this new reality where their son's accomplishments suddenly demanded acknowledgement. Their questions about my exhibition carried a strange mix of genuine interest and compensatory enthusiasm, as if they were trying to make up for their previous inattention all at once. "So this is what you've been working on during evenings and weekends?" my father asked, helping himself to another portion of roasted vegetables. "I thought that was just hobby time." The word hobby hung in the air, revealing volumes about how he'd categorized my artistic pursuits. "It started that way," I acknowledged, trying to keep my tone neutral. "But it evolved into something more serious about 2 years ago." 2 years, my mother repeated, her expression suggesting she was mentally reviewing what she'd know or failed to know about my life during that period. "And the gallery approached you directly?" "No, Mom. Like I said, it was a juried competition. One submitted my portfolio like hundreds of other artists." "Without telling anyone you were doing it," she noted, a hint of accusation in her voice. And there it was, the subtle shift from surprise to wounded indignation. The implication that my privacy had somehow been a betrayal rather than a response to years of conditional attention. "I told people," I corrected. "Just not you or Dad." The bluntness of my response created another moment of uncomfortable silence. Across the table, my cousin Ethan suppressed a smile, clearly enjoying the disruption to our family's usual carefully choreographed interactions. James has been developing this body of work for quite some time, my grandmother interjected smoothly. His approach is very process-oriented. Not everything is meant for public consumption until it's ready. My mother's lips tightened slightly. She and Grandma Rose had always maintained a cordial but somewhat distant relationship. My mother, the corporate attorney with her structured worldview and emphasis on quantifiable achievements, had never fully understood her mother-in-law's more philosophical approach to life and accomplishment. "Well, we're very proud, of course," my mother said, her tone suggesting she was recalibrating her response. "It's just surprising to learn about such a significant event from Eleanor rather than from you." Directly, I took a sip of water, buying time before responding. The truth that I'd grown tired of having my achievements diminished in comparison to Diana's seemed too confrontational for the dinner table. But the diplomatic alternative felt like conceding a point I wasn't willing to concede. James likely wanted to establish his artistic identity independently, Eleanor suggested, her decades of mediating classroom conflicts evident in her diplomatic framing. Many artists feel the need to develop their voice away from family expectations. My father frowned slightly. "What expectations? We've always supported both our children's interests." Diana made a small, involuntary sound that might have been a suppressed laugh or a scoff. All eyes turned to her. "Sorry," she said, not looking particularly apologetic, "but that's not entirely accurate, Dad. My sister's unexpected entry into this increasingly tense conversation surprised everyone, most of all me." Diana had long been the diplomatic one, the peacekeeper who smoothed over family tensions rather than highlighting them. "What do you mean?" my father asked, his tone suggesting he was genuinely perplexed. Diana placed her fork down carefully. "I mean that James and I have had very different experiences of family support. My achievements have been celebrated loudly and publicly. His have been acknowledged politely. Then the conversation moves on usually to me." She glanced at me. "It's not fair. And it's not new." The table had gone completely silent. Even my younger cousins, usually oblivious to adult undercurrents, seemed to sense the significance of what was unfolding. "That's simply not true," my mother protested, though her voice lacked conviction. "We've always been equally proud of both of you." "Pride isn't the issue, Mom," Diana continued, with the precision that made her so formidable in academic settings. "It's attention and engagement. When was the last time you spent 15 minutes asking James detailed questions about his work? Because you spent at least that long this morning on the phone with me discussing my fellowship application, which isn't even due for another month." I stared at my sister, simultaneously grateful for her unexpected advocacy and uncomfortable with being at the center of a family confrontation. This wasn't how I'd imagined the evening unfolding when Eleanor had first called attention to my exhibition. "I think what Diana is trying to express," my grandmother said gently, "is that families sometimes develop patterns of attention that become self-reinforcing over time. It's no one's fault, really, just a dynamic that benefits from occasional recalibration." My father, looking genuinely disturbed, turned to me. "Is that how you feel, James? That we've favored your sister?" All eyes were on me now, waiting for my response. The moment felt pivotal, a rare opportunity to address a dynamic that had shaped much of my life, yet fraught with the potential to fracture our family's carefully maintained harmony. "I think," I said carefully, "that you and Mom have always been more comfortable with Diana's path. It's familiar to you. Academic achievement, prestigious institutions, clear metrics of success. My interests and choices don't fit as neatly into those categories, so they've been harder for you to engage with enthusiastically." "That's not fair," my mother objected. "We've never discouraged your creative interests. Not actively discouraged, no," I acknowledged. "But you've never really engaged with them either. When I was 16 and won that regional digital art competition, you didn't come to the award ceremony. Dad, you had a work dinner you couldn't reschedule. Mom, you had that brief due the next morning. That was one event years ago," my father protested. "The following month, when Diana was recognized at the science fair, you both rearranged your schedules to be there," I continued, surprising myself with how clearly I remembered these details. "Including postponing that deposition, Mom." My mother had the grace to look discomfited. "That was different circumstances." "It wasn't, though," Diana interjected quietly. I remember being surprised you both came because it was just a district-level recognition. James's award was statewide. Another silence fell over the table, heavier than before. My aunts and uncles looked varying degrees of uncomfortable, caught in a family dynamic that had clearly been simmering beneath the surface for years. Perhaps, Eleanor suggested, her tone deliberately light, this is a conversation the immediate family might want to continue privately. But before we change the subject, I do think everyone should make plans to visit James's exhibition before it closes next weekend. It truly is remarkable work. Her diplomatic pivot created space for a less charged topic, and the conversation gradually shifted to logistics about the gallery's location and hours. Yet something fundamental had changed in the atmosphere. The careful facade of perfect family harmony had cracked, revealing the complicated reality beneath. As dessert was served, my mother's signature, tiramisu, which under normal circumstances would have received her standard disclaimer about it being nothing special, just something I threw together. I noticed she remained uncharacteristically quiet. My father, too, seemed to be processing what had transpired, his usual confident demeanor subdued. Diana caught my eye across the table and gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. Whether this moment of solidarity would last beyond tonight remained to be seen, but for now, it felt like the first step towards something new, a rebalancing of the family dynamic that had defined our lives for as long as I could remember. As coffee was served, my cousin Ethan turned to me with teenage directness. So, can we actually see this exhibition? It sounds way cooler than the stuff they make us look at on school field trips. His question, free from the weight of our family's complicated history, offered a welcome shift in energy. As I described the interactive elements that typically appealed to younger visitors, I caught Eleanor and my grandmother exchanging satisfied glances. They had orchestrated this disruption deliberately, these two retired teachers, understanding that some lessons require a dramatic interruption of established patterns. What remained to be seen was whether the lesson would take root or if our family would gradually slip back into its comfortable, unbalanced rhythm once the initial shock had faded. As dinner concluded and family members dispersed throughout the house, I found myself helping my mother clear plates in the kitchen, a task that typically gave us a few minutes of one-on-one conversation at these gatherings. Tonight, however, an unusual tension hung between us as we moved efficiently around the kitchen, scraping plates and loading the dishwasher. The tiramisu was excellent, I offered, attempting to ease the strained atmosphere. Thank you. Her response was uncharacteristically brief. My mother typically launched into a detailed explanation of how she'd modified the recipe or apologized for some imagined flaw only she had detected. We worked in silence for another minute before she sighed heavily, placing a serving dish more forcefully than necessary into the soapy water. I don't understand why you wouldn't tell us about something this important, she said finally, her voice tight with what might have been hurt or anger or some combination of both. An exhibition that apparently merited a newspaper review. Were you punishing us? The question caught me off guard with its directness. My mother typically approached emotional confrontations more obliquely. It wasn't about punishment, I replied carefully. It was about self-preservation. Self-preservation? She turned to face me fully, dish towel still in hand. What does that even mean? I leaned against the counter, considering how to explain a decision that had evolved gradually over years rather than being made in a single moment. When I was growing up, any achievement of mine was acknowledged briefly. Then the conversation immediately shifted to Diana. It became clear that her accomplishments were the ones that really mattered, the ones worth extended discussion and celebration. So I gradually stopped sharing things that were important to me, because the pattern was painful. My mother's expression shifted from defensive to something more complex. That's not, she began, then stopped herself. We never intended to make you feel that way. I know, I acknowledged, but intention doesn't always match impact. She was quiet for a moment, absently drying a plate that was already dry. Your father and I, we understood Diana's path. The academic achievements, the scientific research, it was familiar territory. Your creative pursuits were more abstract to us. You're both intelligent, accomplished people, I pointed out. You could have made an effort to understand what mattered to me. You're right, she said quietly, surprising me with her candor. We should have. I should have. Before I could respond, Diana entered the kitchen with a stack of dessert plates. She hesitated at the threshold, clearly sensing she'd interrupted something significant. I can come back, she offered. "No, stay," our mother said. "This concerns you too, apparently." Diana placed the dishes on the counter and turned to face us both. "If you're talking about what happened at dinner, I'm not taking it back. It needed to be said." "Since when are you James's advocate?" our mother asked, a hint of her lawyer's precision in the question. "You've never objected to the attention your achievements receive." "I didn't realize there was a zero-sum dynamic happening," Diana replied. "Not until recently." She glanced at me. "Actually, not fully until tonight, watching how surprised you and Dad were about James's exhibition. It made me realize how little you know about his actual life and work." My mother looked like she wanted to object but couldn't quite find the words. "Last Christmas," Diana continued, "James gave me a digital artwork he'd created specifically for me. A beautiful, interactive piece that responds to voice and movement with evolving patterns based on our shared childhood memories. It must have taken him weeks to program. I have it displayed in my apartment. And literally everyone who visits comments on it." I shifted uncomfortably, unused to hearing my work described so appreciatively by my sister. "When I thanked him," Diana went on, "he seemed surprised that I even liked it. And that's when I started to realize how thoroughly we'd all bought into this narrative where my interests were inherently more valuable than his." "That's not fair," our mother protested. "But with less conviction than before, isn't it?" Diana challenged. "When James was applying to college, you and Dad pushed him toward business programs despite his clear interest in digital arts. When I was applying, you encouraged me to follow my passion for science wherever it led." Our mother looked genuinely startled by this observation. Those were different circumstances. The job prospects were actually quite strong in digital arts and design, especially combined with James's technical skills, Diana finished. "But that didn't fit your preconception of what counted as a serious career path." I watched this exchange with a mixture of gratitude and discomfort. Diana's advocacy was unexpected and touching, but there was something unsettling about having her fight battles I'd long ago resigned myself to handling through strategic disengagement. "I'm standing right here," I reminded them both. "And while I appreciate the support, Diana, I'm capable of speaking for myself." Diana had the grace to look slightly abashed. "Sorry. Old habits. I'm used to being the one who talks in this family." This frank acknowledgement of her own role in our family's communication patterns made me smile, despite the tension of the moment. It was so typically Diana when she recognized a problem. She addressed it directly, even when the problem was partly of her own making. Our mother looked between us, something shifting in her expression. "When did you two start having these conversations? About family dynamics and patterns of attention?" "We haven't been," I admitted. "Not explicitly anyway. This is all coming out now because it needs to," Diana added. "And because Eleanor Vasquez decided to throw a conversational grenade into the middle of dinner." At the mention of Eleanor, our mother's expression tightened slightly. "Yes, that was quite the unexpected intervention from someone who's hardly part of this family. But it was necessary," came my grandmother's voice from the doorway. She stood there with Eleanor just behind her, both women carrying stacks of coffee cups. Sometimes it takes an outside perspective to illuminate what's become invisible to those inside a system. My mother straightened, her attorney's composure reasserting itself. "Rose, with all due respect, family matters are generally best discussed within the family." "And when would that discussion have happened exactly?" my grandmother countered mildly. "How many years would have passed with James's accomplishments remaining peripheral to the family narrative?" Eleanor stepped forward, placing her coffee cups in the sink. "If I overstepped, I apologize. But as an educator for over 40 years, I've seen too many talented young people diminished by family dynamics that unintentionally stifle their potential and confidence." My father appeared in the doorway behind them, taking in the tableau of tense faces. "What's happening here? Kitchen summit without me?" "We're discussing James's exhibition," my mother replied, her tone suggesting this was only partially true. "And apparently our failings as parents." My father's expression shifted to discomfort. "Perhaps this isn't the best time or place." "That's exactly the point," Diana interjected. "It's never the right time to discuss how this family consistently centers my achievements while treating James's as secondary. If Eleanor hadn't forced the issue tonight, when exactly would we have addressed it?" My father looked genuinely taken aback, both by Diana's words and by her confrontational tone, so different from her usual diplomatic approach to family matters. "Diana," he began, his voice carrying the slight edge he used when he felt his authority was being challenged, "I appreciate your concern for your brother. but you're characterizing a complex family dynamic in rather simplistic terms. Diana challenged. When was the last time you attended one of James's art openings before tonight's dinner? When was the last time you called him specifically to ask about his creative projects? Because you've never missed one of my academic presentations, and you call regularly to discuss my research in detail. Our father looked momentarily at a loss, clearly searching his memory for examples that might contradict Diana's assessment. The last opening I invited you to was 2 years ago, I supplied quietly. The group show at the Westfield Gallery. You had a conference that weekend, and I explained that at the time, he said, a defensive note entering his voice. These scheduling conflicts happen. They seem to happen consistently with James's events. My grandmother observed, yet mysteriously resolved themselves for Diana's. The kitchen had become uncommonly crowded, with 6 adults now engaged in a conversation that was rapidly exposing years of unacknowledged family patterns. Through the doorway, I could see my aunts, uncles, and cousins in the living room, pretending not to notice the intense discussion unfolding in the kitchen while obviously straining to overhear it. I think, I said, suddenly feeling the need to diffuse the mounting tension, that we should pause this conversation and continue it another time. When we're not hosting extended family, and when everyone has had a chance to reflect. Typical James, Diana said, though her tone was affectionate rather than critical. Always the peacemaker, even when you have every right to be angry. I'm not angry, I clarified, surprising myself with the realization that this was largely true. I'm hopeful, actually. The fact that we're having this conversation at all is progress. My parents exchanged a look. I couldn't quite interpret something between confusion and concern, with perhaps a hint of shame. Your exhibition, my father said after a moment. We'd like to see it. It's tomorrow, if that works for your schedule. The offer was clearly an olive branch, an attempt to begin addressing the imbalance that had been so starkly illuminated tonight. I could give you a personal tour, I offered, matching his conciliatory tone. The interactive elements work best with some guidance on the first viewing. I'd like that, he replied, a hesitant smile forming. Very much. My mother nodded her agreement, though her expression remained troubled. And perhaps afterward we could have lunch? Just the 4 of us? The 4 of us, our nuclear family, together for a meal without the extended family as buffer or audience. It had been years since we'd done that, I realized suddenly. Our family interactions had gradually shifted to these larger gatherings, where personal conversations remained surface level and brief. I'd like that too, I said. Eleanor and my grandmother exchanged satisfied glances. Their orchestrated disruption had achieved at least its initial goal-cracking, open a family dynamic that had calcified over decades, creating space for something new to potentially emerge. As we returned to the living room to rejoin the extended family, Diana fell into step beside me. Do you think anything will actually change? She asked quietly. I don't know, I admitted, but at least now the patterns are visible. That's the first step. She nodded thoughtfully. I'm sorry, for not seeing it clearly before, for being complicit in it. You didn't create the dynamic, I pointed out, and you certainly didn't ask to be the golden child. No, but I accepted the role pretty comfortably, she replied with characteristic honesty. It's easy to attribute disparities to merit when you're the one benefiting from them. Her self-awareness surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Diana had always been perceptive and quick to adapt when presented with new information. Those qualities had served her well in academic settings. Now she was applying them to our family system. As we rejoined the gathering in the living room, I caught Eleanor watching me with a thoughtful expression. I moved to sit beside her on the sofa. Thank you, I said simply, for what you did at dinner. It couldn't have been comfortable to insert yourself into another family's dynamics that way. Eleanor smiled, the fine lines around her eyes crinkling. At my age, comfort is less important than truth. And your grandmother has been concerned about this pattern for years. Years? I echoed, surprised. Grandma Rose had always been supportive of my creative pursuits, but she'd never explicitly acknowledged the imbalance in my parents' attention. Oh yes, Eleanor confirmed, but family systems are delicate. Confronting patterns directly often triggers defensiveness rather than reflection. We needed the right moment and evidence to compelling to dismiss. The newspaper review, I realized. That's why you brought it. She nodded, a mischievous glint in her eye. Hard to argue with the art section of the Tribune. Your parents may not understand digital art, but they certainly understand external validation from respected institutions. I laughed, despite myself. That's impressively strategic. 43 years of teaching adolescents, Eleanor replied with a wink. You develop certain skills for managing resistant systems. Across the room, I noticed my parents engaged in what appeared to be an intense but quiet conversation, their heads bent close together. My father glanced in my direction, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. Something had shifted tonight. A rebalancing had begun, though where it would lead remained uncertain. The patterns of a lifetime wouldn't transform overnight. There would be backsliding, moments of reverting to established roles, the comfortable familiarity of old dynamics reasserting themselves. But the unspoken had been spoken. The invisible had been made visible. And in that newly created space, something different might have room to grow. The gallery was nearly empty when my parents arrived the following afternoon. Sunday at 11 a.m. wasn't peak viewing time, which was precisely why I'd suggested it fewer observers for what promised to be an emotionally complex family outing. Diana had texted that morning to ask if she should join us, but I'd suggested we keep it to just our parents for this first visit. One significant shift in family dynamics at a time seemed manageable. Two might be overwhelming. I spotted them immediately upon their arrival. My father in his casual weekend attire of pressed khakis and a button-down shirt, my mother wearing the understated designer clothes that were her weekend uniform. They looked slightly out of place among the gallery's white walls and minimalist aesthetic, carrying themselves with the slight stiffness of people in unfamiliar territory. James, my father called, catching sight of me near the reception desk. This is quite impressive already. He gestured around the gallery space with genuine appreciation. The exhibition itself is through here, I explained, leading them toward the east wing. What you're seeing now is just the main gallery area. As we approached the entrance to my exhibition, I felt an unexpected flutter of nervousness. For years, I'd kept my creative work separate from my parents, protecting it from their polite but disengaged responses. Now, I was deliberately bringing them into this space, making myself vulnerable in a way I hadn't since early adolescence. Before we go in, I said, pausing at the threshold, I should explain that these pieces are interactive. They respond to movement, facial expressions, sometimes even the number of people viewing them simultaneously. Each experience is unique. My mother nodded, her expression one of concentration, as if preparing for an important client meeting. We'll follow your guidance, she said, her tone formally supportive. We entered the first installation space, where floor-to-ceiling digital screens created an immersive environment. Currently, they displayed a gently shifting abstract landscape in blues and greens, responding to the movement of the lone visitor across the room. This first piece is called Consensus Reality, I explained. It explores how our perception of the world is shaped by collective agreement rather than objective truth. As more people enter the space, the landscape becomes increasingly structured and defined. With fewer viewers, it becomes more abstract and fluid. As I spoke, the digital landscape began responding to our presence. The abstract forms gradually resolving into more recognizable elements: trees, water, sky, though still with a dreamlike quality that shifted as we moved through the space. The sensors are tracking our positions and movements, I continued. The software interprets that data to create a visual environment that reflects how human perception typically becomes more fixed and conventional in group settings. My father was watching the screens with unexpected attention, his head tilted slightly as he observed how the images responded to his movements. The technology behind this must be quite sophisticated, he noted, professional appreciation in his voice. I developed most of the software myself, I explained. Standard gallery systems couldn't achieve the specific interactions I wanted. My mother turned to me, surprise evident in her expression. You created the software too? Not just the visual elements? The question revealed how little they knew about my work. Yes, I've been coding since high school, remember? The technical and creative aspects are equally important in digital art. We moved through the exhibition space, stopping at each installation as I explained the concepts and technical components behind the work. My parents asked increasingly engaged questions, their initial stiffness gradually giving way to genuine curiosity. At the central installation, the one featured in the Tribune Review, we paused for nearly 15 minutes. Titled Reflections on Reflections, it used cameras and facial recognition technology to capture viewers' expressions. fragmenting and incorporating them into an evolving digital landscape that represented the malleability of memory and identity. "This is extraordinary, James," my father said quietly, watching as his own expression was captured, transformed, and integrated into the artwork. "I had no idea you were working at this level of sophistication." "Because you never asked," I replied, the words emerging before I could moderate them. Rather than becoming defensive, my father nodded slowly. "You're right. I didn't ask." He turned to face me directly. "I've been thinking about what was said last night, about patterns of attention in our family." My mother moved to stand beside him, forming a united front as they had so often during my childhood when delivering important parental messages. "We both have," she added. "And while some of what was said felt harsh in the moment, we recognized there was truth in it." I nodded, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected acknowledgement. "Your work is remarkable," my father continued, gesturing to the installation before us. "Not just technically impressive, but conceptually sophisticated. It says something meaningful about human experience." "We should have been paying attention," my mother added, her voice carrying a note of regret I'd rarely heard from her. "Not just to your work, but to the message it was sending, about what matters to you and how you see the world." I swallowed against a sudden tightness in my throat. After years of keeping my creative work separate from my family life, this moment of genuine recognition felt almost disorienting in its intensity. "There's one more installation," I said, gathering myself. "It's in the back room." I led them to a smaller, more intimate space where the final piece of the exhibition was displayed. Unlike the others, this installation was partially physical, a desk with objects that appeared ordinary but were embedded with sensors that triggered digital responses on the surrounding screens. "This one is called Family Systems," I explained, watching their reactions carefully. "It explores how family dynamics shape individual identity through patterns that often remain invisible to those within them." As my parents approached the desk, the screens around them activated, displaying abstract representations of interconnected systems that shifted and evolved as they interacted with the objects. When my father picked up a small framed photograph, the digital elements reconfigured to show patterns of connection that emphasized certain relationships while diminishing others. "The patterns change based on which objects you touch and how you arrange them," I explained. "It's a metaphor for how family systems adapt and reconfigure while maintaining certain fundamental dynamics." My mother was watching the screens intently, her analytical mind clearly processing the implications. "This is about us, isn't it?" she asked quietly. "About our family," I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "When did you create this?" my father asked, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "About a year ago," I replied. "It was the last piece I completed for the exhibition." My mother reached out to touch another object on the desk, a small key that triggered a dramatic reconfiguration of the patterns on the screens, creating new pathways of connection where none had existed before. "It's showing that systems can change," she observed, "that established patterns can be disrupted and reformed." "Yes," I confirmed. "Family dynamics aren't fixed even when they seem immutable. New awareness creates the possibility for different patterns of interaction." My father was watching the shifting digital landscape with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between recognition and regret, with perhaps a hint of hope. "Your grandmother orchestrated quite the intervention last night," he said finally. "She and Eleanor. They saw a pattern that needed disruption," I replied. "And they created the conditions for that to happen. Like this installation," my mother noted, making the connection. "Creating the circumstances for new awareness." I hadn't consciously made that parallel, but she was right. The retired teachers had employed the same principles. My artwork explored strategic interventions that made invisible patterns visible, creating space for new possibilities. "We'd like to do better, James," my father said, turning to face me directly. "We've been unbalanced in our attention and engagement. That wasn't intentional, but intention doesn't excuse impact." He was echoing the very words I'd used with my mother in the kitchen the previous night, suggesting they'd had significant conversations after I'd left. "What does doing better look like to you?" I asked, not challenging but genuinely curious about how they envisioned change. My parents exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. "For starters," my mother said, "regular engagement with your work that doesn't require orchestrated interventions from your grandmother and her friends, and recognition that career paths outside our familiar territory can be equally valuable and worthy of support." my father added. Not just polite acknowledgement, but genuine interest and engagement. These were good starting points, though the real test would be sustained change rather than momentary good intentions. Patterns established over decades wouldn't transform overnight. I'd like that, I said simply. There's something else, my mother added, reaching into her handbag. We brought this. She withdrew a slightly worn leather portfolio that I recognized immediately. My high school art portfolio, the one I'd used for college applications. I hadn't seen it in years, had assumed it had been discarded during one of my parents' periodic decluttering efforts. We found this last night looking through the storage closet in your old room, my father explained. We stayed up late going through it together. I accepted the portfolio with a strange sense of disbelief. You kept this? All these years? Of course we kept it, my mother replied, looking mildly offended at the suggestion they might have discarded it. We've kept all of your important work. And Diana's. I unzipped the portfolio carefully, revealing teenage sketches and early digital compositions, earnest, technically unrefined attempts at artistic expression that nonetheless showed the beginnings of the themes I still explored in my mature work. There's remarkable consistency, my father observed. Even these early pieces show your interest in how technology mediates human experience and perception. The observation caught me off guard, not just the content, which was accurate, but the fact that he had identified a conceptual through-line in work created more than a decade apart. He had been paying attention last night not just to the individual pieces, but to the underlying themes connecting them. The technical execution has obviously evolved dramatically, my mother added. But the core interests are visible even in these high school pieces. This moment, my parents engaging thoughtfully with my creative development, recognizing continuity in my artistic concerns across years, felt like a significant shift. Not just polite acknowledgement of achievement, but genuine engagement with process and content. Thank you, I said, closing the portfolio carefully. For keeping these, and for looking at them with new eyes. We should have been looking more carefully all along, my father replied, regret evident in his voice. But we're looking now, as we left the exhibition, walking together toward a nearby restaurant for the lunch they had suggested. I felt a cautious optimism about the possibility of real change in our family dynamics. The patterns were now visible to everyone involved, which created the necessary conditions for transformation. Whether that potential would be realized remained to be seen, but the foundation had been laid. My phone buzzed with a text from Diana. "How's it going with Mom and Dad? Need backup?" I smiled at her continued readiness to advocate for me, this new aspect of our relationship that had emerged from last night's disruption. "Going well," I texted back. "Real conversation happening. Tell you more later." As we settled at our restaurant table, my parents began asking questions about my current projects and future exhibition plans, tentative steps toward the engaged interest they had promised. The conversation felt different, more balanced, more attentive to my responses, less perfunctory than similar exchanges in the past. One meal wouldn't transform years of established patterns. One exhibition visit wouldn't undo decades of unbalanced attention. But Eleanor's strategic intervention had created an opening, a crack in the system that allowed new possibilities to emerge. And sometimes as my work explored, that's exactly how transformation begins, not with complete revolution, but with small disruptions that make invisible patterns visible, creating space for new systems to gradually take shape. 3 months after the fateful family dinner, I found myself back in my parents' Victorian home for another gathering, this one smaller and more intentional. My mother had suggested a creative family dinner where each of us would share a current project or interest, a direct attempt to create more balanced attention for everyone's pursuits. Diana had initially been skeptical. "Isn't this just creating an artificial structure to force them to pay attention to you?" But I had persuaded her that new patterns often need scaffolding before they can stand on their own. Besides, I'd pointed out they're trying. That counts for something. And they were trying in ways both small and significant. My father had begun calling regularly to ask specific questions about my creative projects, making a visible effort to engage with terminology and concepts previously unfamiliar to him. My mother had surprised me by attending a panel discussion on digital art where I was a speaker, arriving early and taking detailed notes that she referenced in our conversation afterward. These efforts weren't always graceful. Sometimes their questions revealed how little they still understood about my artistic practice, and occasionally the old patterns reasserted themselves during family conversations. but the consistent attempt to create new dynamics mattered more than their occasional missteps. As I helped set the dining room table, my grandmother appeared in the doorway, watching me with evident satisfaction. "Eleanor sends her regards," she said, placing a small package on the table. "She's sorry she couldn't join us this evening. Tell her I'm grateful for her dramatic intervention," I replied, smiling at the memory of Eleanor shouting my name across the dinner table, though perhaps warn her that not all families would respond as constructively to having their dynamics publicly disrupted. My grandmother laughed, the sound warm and knowing. "Eleanor has always had excellent judgment about which systems can bend and which will break. She saw resilience in this family beneath the imbalanced patterns." I nodded, acknowledging the insight. Despite its flaws, our family had always maintained strong underlying connections. The uneven distribution of attention had been painful, but hadn't severed the fundamental bonds between us. "What's in the package?" I asked, nodding toward the small gift Eleanor had sent. "Open it and see," my grandmother suggested, her eyes twinkling with that same mischievous gleam I'd noticed in Eleanor's expression the night of the dinner. I unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a small, elegantly framed article, not the Tribune review of my exhibition, as I'd initially expected, but a much older newspaper clipping. The yellowed paper featured a high school art show from 15 years earlier, with a young James Miller proudly standing beside a digital artwork that had won first place in a regional competition. "Where did she find this?" I asked, genuinely surprised. "I don't even have a copy of this article." "Eleanor keeps everything," my grandmother explained. "She's been following your artistic development since you were in 9th grade. She was the judge for that competition, remember?" I didn't remember, actually. The elderly woman who had presented me with a ribbon and certificate had made no lasting impression on my teenage self. That she had been tracking my creative evolution ever since was both touching and slightly disconcerting. "She thought your parents might like to have this," my grandmother continued, "to fill in some of the gaps in their understanding of your journey." Before I could respond, Diana entered the dining room carrying a bottle of wine and wearing an expression of amused tolerance. "Are we really doing this show? And till dinner?" she asked. "It feels a bit contrived." "Sometimes contrived structures are necessary to establish new patterns," I replied, echoing the explanation I'd given her earlier. "Before they can become natural." She rolled her eyes but smiled. "Fine. But if Mom and Dad start grading our presentations on a curve, I'm leaving." Her joke acknowledged the very dynamic we were working to transform. The implicit comparison that had shaped our family interactions for years. That she could reference it directly, with humor rather than defensiveness, suggested progress in its own right. Our parents joined us moments later, my father carrying a folder that presumably contained whatever he planned to share during dinner. My mother wearing an expression of determined enthusiasm that suggested she was fully committed to this new family experiment. "I see Eleanor sent her contribution," my mother noted, spotting the framed article on the table. "Trust her to have kept a 15-year-old newspaper clipping featuring her friend's grandson." "She's nothing if not thorough in her record-keeping," my grandmother agreed. "And her interventions." My father picked up the framed article, studying the image of my teenage self with a complex expression. "I remember this competition," he said quietly. "We had that client emergency in Chicago that weekend." The fact that he remembered the conflict and recognized it now as a missed opportunity was itself a form of progress. 3 months earlier, he likely would have defended the choice as necessary and reasonable. "Well, we're here now," my mother said, her tone suggesting she was deliberately choosing to focus on present possibilities rather than past patterns. "And I, for one, am looking forward to hearing what everyone is working on." As we settled around the table, the structure of the evening creating intentional space for each family member's pursuits and interests. I caught my grandmother watching the proceedings with quiet satisfaction. The intervention she and Eleanor had orchestrated had achieved its purpose, not solving all family dynamics in a single dramatic moment, but creating the conditions for gradual, intentional change. Diana was right that there was something slightly artificial about this creative family dinner concept. New patterns often feel that way initially, self-conscious, deliberate, lacking the fluid automaticity of established habits. But with repetition and reinforcement, they eventually become as natural as the patterns they replace. As my father began sharing his current project, surprisingly, a local historical preservation initiative rather than a business venture, I noticed my mother watching him with the same attentive interest she had always given Diana's academic achievements. When Diana described a new research direction she was exploring, the family listened with appropriate engagement, but didn't allow the conversation to center exclusively on her work, as it might have in the past. And when my turn came to share my latest creative project, everyone, including Diana, gave me their full attention, asking thoughtful questions that indicated they had been making genuine efforts to understand my artistic practice. It wasn't perfect. There were moments when old patterns flickered briefly to the surface, my mother's slightly more animated response to Diana's research breakthroughs, my father's lingering difficulty with certain conceptual aspects of my work. But these were now exceptions rather than the rule, brief lapses in a new dynamic that was gradually taking root. As dessert was served, my grandmother raised her glass in a subtle toast directed primarily at me. "To seeing and being seen," she said simply. I raised my glass in response, acknowledging both her role in catalyzing this transformation and the continuing journey ahead. Family systems don't change overnight. New patterns require consistent reinforcement before they become self-sustaining. But the first step, making invisible dynamics visible, had been accomplished through one well-timed intervention from a retired art teacher who understood that sometimes the most powerful act of teaching is simply too direct attention where it has too long been absent. "To seeing and being seen," I echoed, including everyone at the table in my response. "And to the courage to create new patterns." 1 year after Eleanor shouted my name across the dinner table, my second major exhibition opened at the Hayworth Gallery, this one a featured installation in the main gallery space rather than the smaller East Wing. The opening reception drew a substantial crowd, including art critics, fellow artists, and collectors interested in digital interactive work. At the center of the gallery, engaged in animated conversation with the museum director, stood my parents, my father in a suit he typically reserved for important business meetings, my mother wearing a dress I recognized from significant professional events in her career. Their presence was not merely obligatory. They had arrived early, eager to see the installation before the crowds arrived, asking detailed questions that reflected a year of gradually deepening engagement with my artistic practice. Diana circulated nearby, proudly explaining technical aspects of my work to her colleagues from the research lab, her genuine enthusiasm for my creative achievements now existing comfortably alongside her own impressive scientific accomplishments. The competitive undertone that had long characterized our relationship had softened into mutual respect and appreciation for our different paths. And in a quiet corner, watching the proceedings with evident satisfaction, stood Grandma Rose and Eleanor Vasquez, the architects of the intervention that had set this transformation in motion. Eleanor caught my eye across the room and raised her glass in a subtle toast, her expression conveying both congratulations and a teacher's pride in a lesson well learned. Family systems can change, given the right conditions, visibility of existing patterns, willingness to acknowledge impact rather than just intention, and consistent effort to establish new dynamics. Not all families have the resilience to undergo such transformation, but those that do often emerge stronger and more authentic in their connections. As I moved through the gallery, accepting congratulations and discussing my work with guests, I carried the awareness that my artistic journey was now fully integrated into my family narrative, neither subordinate to my sister's achievements nor separated as a form of self-protection. The family dinner, where my parents had praised my sister until my grandmother's friend shouted my name, had become a pivotal moment rather than a recurring pattern, the beginning of a new chapter rather than the continuation of an old story. When family dynamics consistently overlook your contributions or minimize your path, consider what might happen if invisible patterns were made visible. Sometimes a strategic intervention, whether your own or from a supportive alike, and create space for new awareness and more balanced attention. The discomfort of disruption is temporary, but the potential for transformation is lasting. What conversation might you initiate? What truth might you speak that could begin shifting a family system toward greater recognition and more authentic connection for everyone involved?